to welcome you to the House, Minister, and to congratulate you on your own personal news, and I was glad to congratulate you personally as well. And I note my former Labour colleague Ivana, writing in today's Irish Times, points out the need for a debate on supports for women in public office. And as somebody who came in, was first elected myself and pregnant with my second daughter, I know how glad I was that there were women Oireachtas members before me who had fought for an Oireachtas creche and for recognition of the need to accommodate not just women but men also with small children in the Oireachtas. So I think it's very positive. I want to thank Senators Higgins and Ruane for putting forward this bill. I'm delighted on behalf of Labour to support it very strongly. I think it is a very positive initiative that they've taken. I think it complements the Citizenship Bill and the Born Here, Belong Here campaign that I've been very strongly involved in with Labour Youth and with Labour. And I do thank you, Minister, for your own engagement with me and with Labour on that bill, and I'm glad that I'll be meeting with your officials next week. And I do very much welcome many aspects of your speech and of the government's approach, in particular your assurance that on the vaccination programme, and I think that's really important given that we've just got news on such positive news on vaccines. Your assurance that that those who undertake vaccination will no information gathered as part of that process will be passed to the immigration authorities. I think that's a really important assurance. I'm also glad that you're engaging on the Catherine Day report recommendation of extending the 5-day period to 30 days for people to come back on the voluntary return issue. And of course, I'm very glad to hear your commitments on the scheme to regularise the position of undocumented migrants and to offer to set a process in train for a pathway to legal residency and ultimately to the privilege of citizenship. Again, that's what we were seeking to do in our citizenship bill, was to ensure that persons living here in Ireland, who have a stake here in Ireland, who have this dreadful fear hanging over them, this uncertainty around their legal status, that they would have a pathway to citizenship. So I'm really glad that we're going to see that scheme announced in coming weeks, and indeed that you say that it will be as broad as possible to cover every eligible undocumented person and their family members. I hope in the course of that we'll be able to discuss also our citizenship fees, which remain very high relative to other EU countries, but more importantly that we'll be able to see a good, robust pathway to citizenship for people here and fulfil the motivations in our bill. However, having welcomed those aspects, I do still regret the fact that the government is seeking to deny this bill a second reading and will be opposed to the government counter motion. We don't think that it's good enough to say that our approach relies on pragmatism and that that's enough for the many, many people who face the fear of deportation. And I think that we've seen in many other instances bills, private members' bills, where there's a general support for their intention, that they have been subject to amendment often by agreement with the proposer. So I'm sure in this case also would be open to amendment. And I would say also that the bill is modest enough in that it only seeks to tie discretion for a temporary period and for that emergency period. So I think that seems very much reasonable to me. I note the figures that others have pointed out, that only 4 people have been removed from the state since March, since St Patrick's Day. And obviously I'm glad to hear that. I think that it reflects a compassionate approach. However, 469 deportation orders have been issued, and since between the outbreak of the pandemic and the end of October, and clearly every one of the 469 people who've received an order will have experienced a great deal of stress, of anxiety, of insecurity as a result of having received that order, even if it hasn't translated into actual deportation. I think what we're also perhaps missing is the number of persons who've been taken up the voluntary return, and sometimes voluntary return can be less than voluntary. I think the figures perhaps mask both the stress and fear and that issue of voluntary return, and I would just ask about that. Many of us will have been contacted, particularly this year, by individuals who have had deportation orders, and I've written to you myself on behalf of a number of people, but in particular somebody who's been resident in Ireland for 14 years, Mr. Ben Akile, who fled Sierra Leone many years ago, who with his partner has been an activist for many years, about whom there's been a good deal written in the press, including in hot press, and who's been ordered to leave the country by 10th December, having received a deportation order. There's a petition calling for revocation of that order, which has more than 21,000 signatures. And I think there's one case of somebody who who, as a result of the receipt of this order, has been subject to the sort of real fear, real substantive uncertainty and stress and pressure that so many others will also have experienced. We've also seen during the course of the pandemic real concerns about threats of deportation for frontline healthcare workers. In November, we know there were approximately 160 people in direct provision working in the healthcare system, and sectors which are significantly populated by migrant workers, including undocumented migrants and asylum seekers, have carried extremely high levels of risk during the pandemic. So I think we need to be conscious of that. We know that in November, 2 healthcare workers, both of whom worked in nursing homes, were instructed to return to Zimbabwe. So while the figures of actual deportations are low, we do know of people who have been on the front line in healthcare and who are have still received orders which again have had the this level of uncertainty and stress for them. Back in May, my Dáil colleague Sean Sherlock called on the government to regularise the status of all undocumented frontline workers during the COVID-19 crisis, and I do, Minister, emphasise and repeat his call. I think as a minimum that should be a commitment that we don't deport those working in the front line in this way. On the government position, again, just to refer to this point about pragmatism, I think it's not enough if for somebody who's facing a deportation order, for somebody who has been working on the front line, to be told that there's a pragmatic approach being taken. And even the Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, on 18th November expressed to the Dáil that he was surprised to hear of people being deported during the pandemic, and stated his view that persons should not be deported to countries with a high incidence of COVID-19. I understand removals from the state this year were to Brazil, where in some regions we know extremely high levels of people have contracted the virus. Since the start of the pandemic, we know that many of those served with deportation orders were from other countries where levels of virus transmission were also very high. And we also know that in May of this year, the United Nations Network on Migration, endorsed by UNICEF, called on all states to suspend forced returns during the pandemic because they increase the exposure of very vulnerable populations. They place additional strain on countries of return, and on a humanitarian basis, they exacerbate trauma and oppression. And I think those are words and a message that are worth emphasising again. I know that there's been comments made suggesting that a more generous approach to citizenship, the suspension of deportations and so on, might be open to abuse. But I think the figures on naturalisation in particular and on citizenship applications remind us that really the sort of scaremongering about abuse that we saw around the time of the 2004 referendum really aren't borne out. That sort of language isn't borne out by the actual reality. And Chloe Manahan in my office has found the data on naturalisation of minors not available to us last week during the debate on our citizenship bill, showing that the number of people applying for citizenship through naturalisation has actually declined steadily in Ireland since 2012, and the share of EU nationals among new Irish citizens has increased from 4% in 2011 to 49% in 2018. I think we can see there the number of applicants from the UK in particular, from Britain, increasing 7-fold since the Brexit vote. And these figures underline just how much accounts of immigration in Ireland are distorted by those who might prefer to be ungenerous in our approach to immigration. ESRI research shows applications for citizenship by naturalisation on the grounds of birth as low as below 100, 76 only in 2018. So I think we need to be cognizant of the real figures when we speak about issues around citizenship and migration. And I know that there are many who are very vocal on this issue,
Senator
unfortunately, and very ungenerous, but I do think we need to challenge their views. And can I just finish, Minister, by just appealing to you to say that I do think on humanitarian considerations, the common good, and considerations of the sort of international imperatives around COVID-19, that it would be intuitive and indeed sensible to bring in a temporary ban in line with the bill proposed by Senators Higgins and Ruane, just for the duration of the pandemic. But I look forward to engaging with you and your department on our citizenship issue and on pathways for undocumented people here.